Hi, I'm Paul.
Hi, I'm Ciaran.
And welcome to Cave Escape Episode 4. Today we'll be talking about the TTIP deal that's been negotiated with the EU for the last 2 years. And we'll also brush upon, if we have time, the inequality disparity between the rich and the poor in America. Firstly, with the TTIP deal, it's left over from last week. We'll be discussing the concept that this kind of corporate deal is coming towards Europe and the effects it has on us as a whole. It's quite a encompassing deal. It's a deal between North America and the EU, and similar things have been done before. NAFTA, which I'll discuss later, it has a large effect on us. Basically, it's covered in a lot of mystery right now with the EU. That there's not much discussion about what it will include, but based on some leaks and some disclosures by the EU itself to give more transparency, certain issues have come about that look quite bad and quite like they will affect us. For instance, here in Britain, public services will be in the firing line due to the corporate deal. It's a trading agreement, so they will make public services more accountable within this. Other things like EU food standards will go down to US level. So which is pretty poor. 70% of US food is actually GM food, and on top of that, probably the biggest component of this trade agreement between North America and the EU, TTIP, is the ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlements, which allows companies to sue governments if government's policies cause a loss of profits for that company. It's very, very controversial, and there's been quite a few sort of acts against it. On the 10th of October, there were hundreds of thousands of people in Berlin who rallied against TTIP, and there's been quite a few petitions and so on in Britain about it as well. And I thought it was just an interesting topic to bring up. Is there anything you want to bring up, Ciaran, at this point?
No, I mean, well, the main thing I wanted to say briefly is how secretive it all is, which is really quite astonishing for such a large trade deal. I mean, I don't know the history of all these transatlantic trade deals that have happened over the decades and years since World War II, but people often talk about in more conspiratorial analysis the Bilderberg Group and this idea of elites the fact that there's a group of elites from Europe and America that meet up every year, about 120 of them, and they've been meeting up in secret since I believe the 1950s, mid-1950s, and it's named after the founder, I believe Bilderberg. It's named after the place they first met, which is, I think it's in Holland, but don't quote me on that, some Bilderberg hotel. And all the wealthiest bigwigs, the wealthiest and most influential bigwigs of the business and political world will be invited to this a meeting every year, and they'll discuss world issues and current affairs, and more conspiratorially minded people will talk about the fact that this is some sort of informal private world government. But I think a more accurate analysis would be it's a form of consensus building, but it's a behind the scenes consensus building, and the consensus that they're building obviously favours business interests and supports the status quo at the very least, tends to support the status quo or the which includes sort of the increase of their own influence and power, these individuals that meet up every year, but the individuals of course changing, usually the politicians more than anyone else, changing on a semi-regular basis, and it reminds me of that sort of really draconian or arcane backwards thinking and structure where the powerful in the world meet up in secret in smoke-filled rooms to knock out these trade deals and diplomatic arrangements, and the fact that it's going on in front of our faces in 2015, and like you said, we only know about what we do know because of leaks and Freedom of Information Act requests, is really quite extraordinary, considering it's going to affect almost 1 billion people on the planet, and it's going to affect the world economy, because the EU and the US combined still represents, I think, over a third of the world economy. Maybe at one point it was a half, but they've lost a lot to China and India in recent years, but they represent, let's say, I think it's close to 40% of the world economy, right? And 1 billion people in the world. And why aren't the citizens being consulted Is there any sort of referendum on this? No. Are even many representatives in the parliaments and the legislatures around the countries, are they being consulted? Well, it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be very much at the top pyramid of the EU, and the ministers of each state will be informed and have some sort of sway in the final negotiations. But it just seems really extraordinary this day and age, in this so-called era of transparency and open access information with the World Wide Web, that these sorts of trade deals still go on, and it's really mind-blowing. So I wanted to say that before you go on to any further analysis, how ridiculous and unjustified that all is anyway.
No, massively. I just add to that, I didn't bring it up earlier, as you said, there have been leaks. In August this year, the EU Trade Commissioner himself promised more TTIP transparency, but the documents that were given out were actually heavily redacted, as most documents are when they're disclosed. And they were actually between the tobacco industry and the EU, which is quite odd. It didn't show much, but it's implying that the tobacco industry are having a big say in the debates. It's all just shrouded in a lot of mystery. I think within this article I'm specifically speaking about, it's a Guardian article. I think it's written by a politician within the EU, who complains in this article about how, even as somebody who's part of the EU, he's kind of having to dig out all this information, and he's having to pass through security to get any kind of information and transparency himself as a politician. That's not the best summary, and we'll show you links of this within our page and so on. So please follow it. But there's also implications and a couple of actual statements, pronouncements that that transparency is not even just not reaching us, but it's not also reaching politicians who work with the EU or within the EU. It's quite worrying. WikiLeaks have now got actually €100,000 out as a kind of bounty to the first leak that comes out from the TTIP deal. So it's clearly quite sought after as well. It's very interesting, and there should be no reason a trade deal between the EU and America should be so quiet. I think one of the reasons is because it basically. And by the way, that's in the introduction, the lack of detail, that it's partly down to that, or mostly down to the fact that we don't really know what's going to happen. It's just that it's talked about. But with comparisons with NAFTA, the deal between Mexico, US, and Canada, that's actually a good way to understand how this TTIP deal might turn out. So this is a NAFTA. The NAFTA deal was between these three countries. It made them into a free trade zone. And people believe TTIP and this will be the same. And it resulted in a lot of pretty difficult, circumstances for all the countries. So, like I said earlier, one of the biggest problems with the TTIP, and which was a problem with NAFTA, was the investor-state dispute settlements. So this ISDS, it basically means that if you're a company and you come to a foreign country or within the deal, so if you go from America to Canada in NAFTA, or if you go from America to France, we assume in TTIP, if the foreign state that you bring a company to has policies that get in the way of your own work, you can sue them for not making the state hospitable enough for the company. And this can be anything. In Canada, which was the most sued country from the NAFTA deal, they were sued because of their environmental laws. I've heard of cases where a company comes to a certain state and it opens itself up and it gets blocked because of environmental laws. So they'll be using chemicals that are illegal or whatever, or they'll be using, clearly, unallowed substances within the business, and they'll consequently be closed lawfully. And because of these legalities, the company can then sue them for basically following what they believe in, almost. And then this happened to Canada, which is the most sued country. They've lost $200 million. Sorry, they've lost $200 million, while Mexico's lost $170 million from the NAFTA deal. Well, the US has, funny enough, never lost a case due to NAFTA. So that also tells you this kind of the centric element of NAFTA, which was America-based. Again, America is dealing with the EU. And on top of this, the idea that was with NAFTA, it would produce jobs, it would produce money. But people debate that now. There's a Huffington Post article, and Huffington Post seem to pick on it quite a lot, in which they talk about how the US have actually got a $181 billion trade deficit with their NAFTA partners. And under NAFTA, there was 1 million net loss of US jobs, while there was a growing income inequality. And another consequence was, people like Mexican campesinos, they're farmers, I think it is, 1 million of them were displaced due to NAFTA. So it's highly debatable if deals like NAFTA and TTIP really benefit the people and the state. And on top of that, it actually means losing. Having to be sued for enacting your own laws, and the EU are now talking about how they think the EU economy could gain 120 billion euros, or 0.5% of its GDP could be boosted because of TTIP, and the US think that they can get 95 billion euros and 0.4% of the GDP, and the UK 10 billion could get 10 billion from the deal. But it's all debatable. It's about how much you want to sacrifice as people. It's going to affect us eventually, and it's giving more powers to people that we've been talking about recently as a nation has been detrimental to our core values. We're talking about things like banks not being closed down for failing. Well, now imagine if a bank performs something illegal, for instance, and we can't sue them and we get sued for putting them in jail for that. So not only did they not go to jail, but if we actually ever got the kind of bravery to put them in jail, as a state could do, we'll actually get sued for it. It's just absolutely upside down world, in my opinion. And just to make a final point before I pass to you, Ciaran, somebody who's also debated was Barack Obama himself. People talk about him on the left as unappreciated figure, and he's done a couple of things recently that make people kind of praise him again. He kind of restored links to Cuba, for instance, and he's bringing back popularity. But he was the one who announced this deal in February 2013. So it kind of brings, in my opinion, it kind of shrouds my image of him once more as somebody who's supposed to be a big campaigner and politician for the kind of the left and left ideas. He's actually also just brought about one of the most corporatist agreements with the TTIP and Europe in the EU. Anyway, sorry, Ciaran, I'll pass over to you.
No, that's great stuff. I agree wholeheartedly. I think this word corporatism you said a couple of times is definitely key. Obviously, we talked about it in episode 2 when we were talking about the Volkswagen scandal. But I think it's worthy to talk about again because it's such a serious issue. And when we talk about things such as capitalism, and when I say capitalism, I don't just mean free trade between two allegedly free individuals and both people prosper as this sort of mythological idea of capitalism. When I'm talking about it, we really are talking about corporatism, and the symbiotic relationship between corporations and large business, especially on one hand, and states on the other, which is detrimental actually to small businesses and obviously the public. This idea that businesses will be able to sue states because they don't conform to the regulations is always is always going to be controversial because different societies are going to want to regulate things in a different way, like you said with environmental laws in Canada and such. But what I will say as well, the economic issues are always going to be difficult and controversial because talking about free trade agreements, and you were mentioning the fact that, well, a lot of Americans and Mexicans lost their jobs under NAFTA. But the question is, well, where did the jobs go and why did they lose them? Because and this is playing devil's advocate from a more truly free market point of view. The argument would be that, well, the jobs have gone to places which are more efficient, maybe for example, the farmers in Mexico, maybe their jobs have been lost because of mechanized high technological advances in Canada and America, which are now forced to compete with. Which you can say, well, from the Mexican farmers' point of view, that's really bad because they've lost their jobs. But yeah, but for the wider public, maybe the quality of the goods has increased, or the cheapness, in fact, over long term may have decreased. So it's always difficult when we're talking about economics, and especially free trade. But for me, the most problematic thing is the corporatism of it all, and there's always favoritism. Like you said, you're talking about the tobacco company in consultation with the EU, and it always seems to be the biggest businesses who get the subsidies, and the regulation is bended so it affects the smaller ones but not the larger ones, and they always have loopholes for themselves and teams of lawyers to make sure that they're able to keep up their status quo of accumulating more capital while everyone else is detrimented by that. So
just to interrupt you, sorry, Ciaran, with the tobacco industry as well, what I find interesting about that is, why did they release exactly those documents? The tobacco industry is quite controversial. If you're trying to prove that your deals aren't, ill-judged or whatever, if you're trying to prove that it's all moral and ethical to a public who are concerned about it, I don't think the tobacco industry is necessarily the first industry on a leak on that list. I'm sure there's other industries that they're discussing the TTIP deal with, who are much less ethically debatable, because the tobacco industry is obviously kind of a symbol of previous corporatism or capitalism gone bad. They've done some pretty horrible stuff. So what I'm thinking here is why these documents? Have they tried to leak somebody who could take the flak but isn't the biggest partner, or are they trying to? Are they actually trying to leak information to disclose information that actually shows you how bad the deals are? I'm not sure, especially because it's all redacted as well. It's just quite there's so much mystery. It's hard to really judge anything from what's come out. But yeah, sorry.
That's true. No, I mean that's true. I mean, I don't have a good answer for that. I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure the circumstance or the context of who exactly leaked it and why, and whether they got reprimanded or whether they got promoted.
Oh, sorry. That was a disclosure by the EU. It's an official disclosure.
Oh, okay, right.
Sorry.
Oh, right, I understand. But you mean why they chose to leak about
tobacco industries?
Yeah, it's a good question. It seems to be an industry that nobody likes or cares for anymore. Though once a time it was. By the way, an industry which I believe to this day, but don't quote me on it, or until very recently, at the very least, is in the US subsidised. So the farmers, the tobacco farmers, get billions of taxpayers' dollars to grow tobacco, which they obviously sell to companies, and the conglomerates which own the tobacco farms turn that product into a highly addictive, highly lethal substance called a cigarette, and millions of people smoke it. And it's funded by it's funded by taxpayers. How crazy is that? They're subsidised. They have a big lobby, a big tobacconist lobby, which has been around, I believe, since like the 50s, and maybe it's lessened over the last decade or two, but I'm pretty sure until almost very, very recently, and up until this day, I could look it up quickly now, but I think almost up until this day, there's subsidies for tobacco farmers. So this is a ludicrous thing. But
and nicotine is the most addictive drug, isn't it, as well?
I believe so. I think the studies show that it's the most addictive drug. So it's really crazy. And they talk about this, the war on drugs and all this nonsense. When you got the state funding tobacco farmers, and that drug's okay because we've got a lobby there who gives us money and they pay for our campaign elections, so that drug's allowed. That's fine. But the one thing I did want to talk about very briefly is from a more radical and more anti-systemic viewpoint, is just some quick historical analysis to try and think of one reason explaining why this is happening and why this is happening now. And again, from a broadly critical, say, Marxist or anarchist position, you could argue that this is a process of sort of further centralisation in what academics usually call late capitalism or modern capitalism, mergers and acquisitions of large transnational corporations, many of which support these political institutions such as the EU and other states and international bodies such as the World Trade Organization. Because they get influence, if they support these bodies, they can bend regulations so that they support their businesses and can stamp out their competition, usually smaller businesses, something which has been going on openly at least since the 1980s with this sort of neoliberal turn where everything's becoming privatised more and more. And obviously this accelerated after the Cold War. And it's just, again, this idea that companies, they need to continuously increase their profit margins, their public corporations, and legally they have to always seek to maximize their profits. And they're seeking out new ways to doing this, and they're quite happy to support these any political ambitions to create more free trade zones. Because if they can't make money via new innovation or mergers and acquisitions or subsidies from governments, they're gonna vie for this form of deregulation and corporatism and crony capitalism, where they can get insider deals where it's all secretive, and they're going to be able to sue the government if the governments don't do X, Y, or Z in the future. And in my opinion, you can argue it's just another step, and it's a historical process, and you're going to see more and more mergers between European and American companies. They won't be competing as much with each other compared to, say, the more recent Asian companies, especially in China and to a lesser extent India. Arguably there's some geopolitical moves as well. The fact that the US, maybe elements within the US elite, realise they're struggling, and they still have these cultural biases about US being the hegemon of the world, and this is a way to sort of stem the flow of China or other powers competing with them. They're merging their economy with the European Union, sort of slowly but surely, and to try and boost their GDP in other ways. So,
at a time when the Chinese premiers just visited London or Britain to make more business deals with Britain.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. Everyone bows down to those with the money, right? So, the same way Britain and the US are happy to do business with China. I mean, the US is still China's biggest trade partner. They're still the two biggest trade partners in the world, and obviously the UK is going to be there with arms open, going, please invest in our economy just as much as any state. But I could imagine the military and sort of foreign policy wonks thinking that this trade deal would be a good idea for sort of future geopolitical issues, and keeping the US a dominant power. But from an economic standpoint, it all seems a bit redundant now. But
I think there's a relevance here, and also bringing up the EU's part. A lot of people, I think, still believe, I think it's a myth, that the EU was brought together for peace reasons. I think that's even what it says. Here's what it says on the EU website. Even I had to do an essay about this in my masters. We read a good book by a chap, an economist who's quite famous, Barry Eichengreen, and he describes in this book how actually the EU didn't really evolve out of desires for peace. It actually evolved because America wanted to use the EU as Europe as a buffer zone between itself and Russia. After the Second World War, so they gave oh gosh, Ciaran, you'll remind me, what was the loan the Americans gave to Europe after the
Marshall Plan?
Yes,
yeah.
Marshall Plan. They gave the Marshall Plan money as a way to set up various commissions. They're trying to use it to manipulate Britain and France and Germany, mostly those three countries, to come together and form the EU. And there's various kind of little attempts at it. There was the EEC and the EEC, and before that there's a couple other commissions. And it's actually quite funny. If you read the book, it talks about how there was politics between Britain and France and Germany, how Britain would make its own trade and unions separate to them. And it's a very interesting book, and it kind of warps your view that actually this is a peace EU involved out of bringing peace to Europe. It's actually not. It's actually involved out of firstly trying to destabilize, or trying to kind of destabilize Russia, the East, by unifying Europe. At a time when France didn't want Germany in any sort of union, they still really disliked them. And de Gaulle, the French president, was at a time believing that this would be the new French Empire. This kind of union he'd form out of Europe. Britain, on the other hand, didn't want to involve himself because they still had the Commonwealth, and that was bringing in loads of money. So they were not sure until '73 when they joined it. So it's just an interesting exposure of them as well as a union, that they really heralded as a kind of great kind of portrayal of democracy, or kind of, as everybody loves unity, unity as well. But actually, this is a really dodgy deal, and they don't seem to be kind of really checking with the people who are affected by it. They're just doing it for, again, money reasons, which goes back to their own roots.
Yeah, that's even to this day, the US will casually make subtle threat to Britain about if you leave the EU, we're not going to be your friends anymore. Essentially, in a very childish way, they essentially say we want Britain inside the EU because they know they can easily influence Britain on certain decisions and probably manipulate them with this idea of a special relationship, and that they'll give them favourable trade deals, and that the US is still there trying to. They're the ones from the outside forging the union, making sure it sticks together because they get their own advantages out of it. But I think I don't know how accurate it is anymore, because obviously there are many people in the US that think that the European Union's a threat to their dominance, their economic dominance, especially with the introduction of the euro, as an alternative global currency, which it sort of, maybe not so much these days, but it was before the economic crisis, seen as that, because around 25%, I believe, of global currency reserves are in the euro, and I think the US dollars is about 60% or just under now. And they were worried about it catching up and competing too much with the US as a global reserve currency that all the countries do their trade deals in and have billions of in reserve to support their economies, which gives the US a huge economic advantage for multiple reasons that I think economists can better explain than I can, but it does.
I think economists can explain it themselves. I think there's a lot of kind of prediction of economy that's much harder to do than they make it seem. Anyway, sorry.
Well, I think one of the basic things is the idea that they can export their inflation worldwide, and it doesn't affect them as much because every country has US dollars in reserve and uses US dollars to trade internationally with one another.
Which is what China has used against them, hasn't it? They've been buying. They've been using US dollars to kind of deflate their own price, haven't they? I think. I don't want to get into the waters that I'm not very familiar with, but I do know for a fact that countries such as China and Russia have been signing unilateral trade deals to trade in their own currencies, or rather in China's currency rather than US dollars now, which a lot of people have talked about as this is the slow decline of the US dollar hegemony, because more and more countries are going, actually, the US are just inflating their currency of all this quantitative easing that they did over the last 5 to 6 years, and they can manipulate interest rates for their own benefits, and it doesn't really help us. So why can't we just trade in another currency which we think is more stable, or one which we'll get more advantages out of, such as China's renminbi, or whatever it's called, renminbi. Well, this is what I was trying to say. Actually, China have been buying America's money as a reserve, I believe. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but they've been buying it to kind of inflate US prices, but deflate theirs. And they're trading with the US as well.
Because China has an active policy of devaluing their currency for export reasons, because if it's a cheaper currency, you can buy more. So it's a form of manipulation. But at the same time, they own like over $1 trillion worth of US debt. But then they seem to be selling it off subtly now, bit by bit, and buying loads and loads of gold. So people talked about these trends. I must admit, I'm not an expert in it. I don't follow it as closely as other issues. But a lot of it, I would argue, I mean, maybe people would say it's too simplistic and too macro, but a lot of this, going back to the TTIP deal, it's to do with the system we live in and this continuation of it. This where all these big corporations, they want to gain more capital and keep getting more profits. Politicians love having their power, and this corporatism favours them both, and they want to keep it up at all expenses, right? Even if it's harming their own economies or the people or society at large, and it's really quite tragic.
No, exactly, and I've also studied deregulation in America. There's another great book about this, which I'll put in the YouTube or the blog post. But I studied that as well in my master's, and that's interesting in itself. That deregulation has come in swarms and waves in America's history since the late 1900s, and actually, people are arguing on the left that actually deregulation. So regulation has clamped down on corporations, but actually what they do is corporations get so powerful after regulation. They get corporations are so powerful that even after regulation, they build enough of a lobby that they manage to deregulate themselves again. There's just a cycle of them building lobbies up again and again and again just to defeat regulation and deregulate themselves. This is the same probably case here. I'm sure there's some lobbying going on in some way between America and the EU, and they've therefore managed to push forward probably the next form of deregulation on a more global scale now. And what I think we have to learn is that regulation does work. I've seen statistics in this study that regulation does clamp down on corporatist problems and enforces other stuff, and there's more equality as a consequence. That is true, but that the regulation it just cannot hold corporations in power. Out of power. The regulation, no matter how many times you enforce it, does end up crumbling, and there has to be some other solution that we have to find, because regulation is great in the short term, in the long term it fades. So I think that's very interesting, and we'll see what happens now. And to be honest, I really hope this deal doesn't go through. And just bringing back to a previous point, I really it really highlights to me Barack Obama, who. I got to admit, there are times when I like him, and this policies he puts forward that I like. But then you forget about things like drone strikes, and you forget about things like the TTIP deal that he announced in February 2013. It doesn't look good on him, in my opinion. I think it's another nail in his coffin, in my view. And I know people like that love him, but it's just how I feel about him now. That he's really good at playing the game in some ways. He's good at appearing on the left side politically and doing some great policies. But actually, these kind of secretive deals or the kind of policies he has out of the limelight are very, very, controversial in my opinion. And this is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, look, Obama's definitely part of this part of the. I keep saying the status quo, but he's very much a part of that nexus. And even if you go back and read his campaign speech, he talks about the fact I don't hate Wall Street. Right, I don't hate these businesses. I believe in capitalism. So liberals love to think he's some sort of social democrat or socialist, and he's actually not really. Did anyone go to prison from all the corruption and fraud that occurred through the financial crisis? Trillions of dollars worth of fraud, probably ongoing, because I don't think it stopped. Well, some businesses got fined, and they got large fines. Well, the problem with that is that if the fine of, say, $10 billion comes your way, well, that's a big hit to the company, but maybe you made $15 billion from the fraud that you did over the last 15 years, which would probably be underestimating how much they made from it, right? So they go, well, we made $15 billion and we took a hit of $10 billion from a fine. Well, we got $5 billion plus, so let's carry on going. I mean, how's that going to stop anything? It's nonsense.
No, exactly. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no. The other thing I will say though, Paul, just as a sort of counterbalance to this idea of regulation, I think we have to think about. It's not just deregulation versus regulation. It's what sort of regulation there is, because there's lots of regulation which is put in place which actively defends larger businesses and clamps down on smaller ones and cracks down on competition. And we talk about, well, it's regulating this and that, but in a way you can have transnational corporations with armies of lawyers working for them who know all the loopholes, whereas to get around the regulations that they've helped put in place, which clamp down on their medium and smaller sized businesses, which are the competitors, who then get squashed because they don't have the money or the resources to get past this red tape. So from a more sort of from a more free market / libertarian standpoint, it's this idea that there is a lot of regulation out there, but it's bad regulation, and it's actively harming certain elements of business, well as supporting larger elements. And one example of this might be the fact that we get cash insured by the financial institutions, that is, in the bank, primarily the banks. So in America, it's like the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission or regulatory body they have there, right? And it says that the federal government is going to ensure that any deposits you have in a bank up to this amount will be protected if something goes wrong in the bank. And you think, well, that's great and that's wonderful, but how that distorts the economy and what advantage that gives to these banking interests, because they know that, well, if anything goes wrong, all of these savings that we're playing around with, people's money that we're gambling on our own bets and our own market schemes, if they're going to be propped up by the federal government anyway. I mean, that's a form of regulation that they've put in place to try and safeguard the people, where it actually makes it more detrimental and destabilizes the economy as a whole, because the people playing around with the money think that, well, there aren't many problems or issues with us doing that, because the government's they're going to bail everyone out anyway. So when it comes to regulation, it's what sort of regulation and why and who does that affect? Because I mean, I would argue that if you're looking at the regulatory codes of the European Union and the UK government now, you'd probably take you a lifetime to read all of them. The books would stack in the hundreds, if not thousands, for each industry of what you got to adhere to. And the question I would have is, who does this benefit? Because more often than not, it seems to be that the regulation that gets through and that is in place, it will be protecting the big business, or they have loopholes which allow them to get through it, and all the small businesses, they're the ones who get smashed, and they just get completely pushed out of the market, and that's their competition. And it's again a form of this corporatism. So that's the other worrying thing, not just that corporations can deregulate the market, they can regulate it for their own benefit. They can get politicians to regulate the hell out of those small businesses who are competing with them, and they're just going to disappear. So this is the worry, in my opinion. I'd have just as much as the sort of deregulation argument. I don't know what you thought about that.
No, entirely. I mean, I don't really have much to add to that, really. I think it's spot on, is that it doesn't work either way, that something has to change. If it's deregulated, it suits corporations. If it's regulated, it suits the corporations or the big businesses. And look at how the EU does it. Look at the farmers who are hit and so on. It's very murky territory, and there has to be a solution, unfortunately, that I think is not being put in place. But I actually think this leads on to the next article quite well, if you'd like to talk about it.
Yeah, sure thing. So the article I sent to Paul, it was posted by Washington's blog, which was one of my favourite blogs. It probably still is, but I think it's gone a little bit downhill over the last couple of years as it's become more mainstream. And the people behind Washington blog, I believe there's two of them, and one of which is academic or retired academic. And it's completely anonymous by the owners of Washington blog. We don't know who they are. But they do some really great critical analysis, pointing out the contradictions and hypocrisies, especially in US domestic and foreign policy, and the economy as well. And they've been going since 2007. So if anyone likes alternative blogs, I would recommend Washington's blog. And they've got some really fascinating articles, and they have a great way of breaking it down into bullet point bite-sized chunks where everything is cited. They'll link to everything. Unfortunately, the links don't always work, but if you hover over the link, and you can right-click it and find out what the link was meant to be before, and go back to the Internet Archive website and find it, because some of the links obviously they go out of date and you can't be accessed anymore. But they're really usually quite judicious with their citations to what they're talking about and discussing. So anyway, the article itself, or the title is, I'll just read it to you. The article, it's a very short article. I can pretty much just read it to you, paraphrase it anyway. So the article itself is titled, US inequality is more than 69 times higher than what most Americans think it should be, and more than 13 times what Americans assume it actually is. So this was a study conducted by, it was in a new book by someone called Les Leopold. I'm not sure if his name's actually Les. It's probably just Lee, isn't it? I'm really awful. It sounds like a French name. And the study was of what the American public estimate that the head of a company, a CEO of a company, earns, and between it's what Americans estimate the worker/CEO pay gap actually is. And what it should be. So it's asking them what they think it is and what it should be. And by the worker CEO pay gap, we mean how many more times the CEO of a company gets paid compared to the worker's salary on I believe, an annual basis. So there's one chart, and I can pretty much just read it out. But essentially, he interviewed. He interviewed, I believe, hundreds of people from all different political backgrounds. So there's strong Democrat, strong Republican, and there's people with degrees, people without degrees, and it goes over what they think the pay gap is and what they think it should be and what it actually is. So, for example, somebody who strongly associates themselves as a Democrat supporter, they think that the pay gap between a worker and a CEO in America is 36 to 1. So the CEO will be paid 36 times to 1. That's what they think it is in reality. What they think it should be, they think it should be about 5 to 1. They think the CEO should earn about 5 times as much as a worker. Then you have Republicans where they think it's about 40 to 1, but they also think what it should be is about 12 to 1. That's a strong Republican affiliated supporters, right? Now, this is the most interesting thing for me, actually, was that those who have less than a high school degree, so in America that's considered formally uneducated, right? You don't have your high school degree. They were the most accurate, but even they were way out. So they thought that it was 60 to 1. They thought the average CEO of a company earned 60 times what the worker does. And they think it should be about 5 to 1, right? Now, in actual fact, modern day America, a CEO earns on average, this is on average, which is really extraordinary, 829 times what a worker will earn. So the head of the company will earn on average 829 times compared to what the worker will earn, which is really, so everybody was completely way off, even guessing what it actually is compared to reality, and even trying to, I mean, the more worrying thing is what they think it should be. So even the staunchest Republicans or those affiliated themselves with as a Republican, and usually they believe have free market tendencies, right? And they think it should be about 12 to 1. Like that's a fair wage differential between the CEO of a company and a worker and a general employee. But they were way off, 829 to 1. It just shows the inequality, and it links to an article that I posted on my Facebook page a short while ago, which was it was a report by not Swiss Credit,
Swiss Credit.
Swiss Credit, yeah. It's a report by them and they measured global financial wealth in terms of asset wealth. So that can be property as well as cash and any stocks and shares and bonds you may own. So asset means, yeah, in that regard, I believe was any sort of anything worth any physical thing which is actually worth some money, basically. And according to their study, the top 1% in the world, so this is a global study, the top 1% in the world, their asset wealth is the top 1%. The top 1% of those in the world own or control 50% of the total asset wealth of the world, which has just got worse and worse over the last decade. I believe at the start of the decade it was something like 40%, but this study has just really struck me as something ludicrous. So I'll say that again. According to this study, the top 1% of people in the world, they have half the world's assets. Just to show you how extraordinary the inequality is worldwide. And even though it's just repeating what we said previously with regards to the TTIP article, I'm going to say it's just this is the system. It's just making it worse and more unequal. And this is clearly not because those 1% of people work harder and work longer hours, or they're all geniuses, and there's something clearly wrong in the system for this to happen, and to allow this to happen is really extraordinary. So I think in the terms of inequality in America and places in Europe, it's actually worse now than it was in Victorian times.
No, really?
Yeah, honestly, honest to God. Which is just really, really shocking. I believe in America at least. Anyway, maybe I'm not entirely sure in Britain, but in terms of asset wealth, it is at least. So it just hits home. I'm not an expert in economics, and I don't pretend to be, but the political implications and the social implications of this is just extraordinary. However, the other thing we should say, I think I would want to say, is that when we talk about the top 1% in the world, it's difficult to call them all bad guys, because I'm sure Paul and I's parents would be in the top 1%, because you'd think you'd need to earn millions and millions of pounds to be in the top 1% in the world globally. But I believe to be the asset wealth you'll need to be in the top 1% globally is close to $500,000, I think. Which asset wealth means obviously how much a house is worth and how many stocks, shares, bonds, and savings you have as well. So there are huge amounts of people still, quite large amounts of people still in Western Europe and America and parts of China would definitely be within this 1%. So we're not talking about a very small number of parasites at the top. But clearly, even if you're not, for example, the head of a nation or the head of a corporation who's actively trying to influence the system and regulate it a certain way, so you benefit from it and support the status quo. Although it gets problematic in some sense, there are many people who are just saying, I was going to say, many people who are doctors, for example, in Western countries would be part of the 1%. Now the question is, well, a doctor in Britain, how much of the problem is he? Well, he's probably not part of the problem. So just identifying the fact that there's a 1% and the rest and there's an inequality there, I don't think it's easy. You have to look at the professions and in which ways they're supporting this system, because I wouldn't want to put doctors, for example, just as an example, in the same category as some politicians and some heads of corporations, right? Who they're just trying to help patients and they maybe run their own private practice and they make a lot of money from that. I'm not sure that's entirely a bad thing. But anyway,
just to help you out here, I have another statistic that says, and it's a Guardian statistic from last year in May, that says that actually in Britain the 1% there own as much as the poorest 55%. So
wow, so it's even more extreme in Britain than around the world on average. Wow. So
and also that since I got a Russia Today article as well. And although Russia Today are also quite anti-West, I think that's worth putting out there.
Yeah.
They quote a report that says that Britain are the only G7 country to rise in inequality since the financial crisis. So, I back you up there. The global statistics are complicated, but what you're saying definitely holds true for Britain. Macrocosmically compared to the rest of the world.
It depends how the report's broken down, because there's a difference between asset wealth as well and income. So there's a top 1% of income compared to asset wealth, and it varies obviously depending on which metric you're using. But I think the report by Swedes Credit, they were just they were talking about around the world on average. So it's not like in every single country it has to be this. But anyway, I think it's pretty extreme.
No, absolutely. I think one of the weirdest things is that I'm not that shocked by it anymore. I just come to expect it, and that's quite sad in a way that I don't really question that this is the case. I guess the counter arguments I might have to put up there, just from the top of my head, really, is that it's true that the inequality might be worse than in Victorian times, but the other side is that actually quality of life is probably better because people used to actually live in slums in Victorian times. And then just to put a counter argument and be devil's advocate to everything we've done so far, which I don't believe in. I'm just saying, and I just want to put out there, is that some people complain about things like corporations and how much money they make and how little they pay their staff, for instance. And I agree, but then the other side is that as a consequence of corporations, we do have, cheaper food or cheaper products and so on. It's a bit like earlier when you mentioned, the millions who lost their jobs under NAFTA, and the idea of where they actually went afterwards. Was it benefiting the public more? But these are devil's advocates arguments. If I'm honest, I don't think that's an excuse. Still, I really dislike the idea that you can look back to 100 years and say you should notice progress, and we have progress in inequality, but I think you should also say, like, we could expect a lot better, to be honest. And I think it is worrying, not so much because I think my life is poorer directly actively as a consequence, not actively but every day as a consequence. I think we live a better life, but that in terms of liberty and just ideals and the idea that you can have a say, because it's diminished by, I think, this statistic, that I think that if somebody has 1% of the wealth, that really affects us in terms of ways you don't really realize, and it's not necessarily to do with obvious wealth and lifestyle inequality. I mean, to make a comparison, in schools, right now I'm talking about achievement gaps, where 38% of disadvantaged pupils are said to only achieve 5 good GCSE grades, including English and maths, while 65% of other pupils who don't have the same backgrounds. And disadvantage can mean a mixture of things. Doesn't mean just inequality, can mean abusive and so on. But the other side is pupils who do have wealth and do live what we can maybe call an average life are 65% more likely to get good grades. So the wealth. That is an example actually where wealth does affect us. People that we don't know, actually. Well, people that we might not know. Sorry.
Oh no, definitely. But I know exactly what you mean. I'd agree with all the points you made. I mean, especially the devil advocate ones. It's important to remember how far technologically humanity as a whole has come, despite some of the limitations and corruption within the systems we have. There's definitely enough. There's been enough freedom there for advances to be made, which then trickle down to the poorer people or poorer, society. You can look at disease and, like you said, agricultural food products. I mean, the fact that we don't have to spend the majority of our income in the West on food, whereas once upon a time, I could talk to my nan and she'd probably say that when she was growing up that probably 30, 40, maybe 50% of their daily income would just go to food, and then they'd have 50% of it left maybe to save and invest in things that they care about, or other things that they need, like energy and such. But this day and age, I think, in the West at least...
That's interesting, because that could also be a kind of a reflection of how value has changed as well. So food was more valuable then. But I remember talking to one of my friend's mums a couple of months ago, or a month ago actually, and she was telling me how rent was really cheap when she was younger, and probably in comparison to food. She said that she'd, would spend most of her money in whatever the month before she was paid, and the last week she'd say, "All right, I'm going to have to save £60 this week to pay my rent." And she had a flat in Pimlico in London, which is a fairly central place.
Yeah.
So, she was saying it was so cheap. It was such a a relative part of the wage. But now, obviously, people are talking about London becoming a wealthy man's paradise, and people are clearly buying houses in London because of the asset value and because of the future value. And that's become probably the new food in a sense. People are spending most of their money on rent.
Yeah.
Are definitely spending less on food. So it's interesting that what value has changed in that sense as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The regulation debate we had feeds into this, because if you look at food, for example, all the large farming conglomerates, they get subsidies from the EU. We have a common agricultural policy, right, where everyone puts in billions of euros or of their own currency, and it gets divided out and given to farmers to subsidise them. So this is one reason food's probably maybe slightly cheaper for us, subtly, even though your tax money goes into it. But externally, the harm it does to the farmers around the world due to
dairy farmers as well. Oh, you're talking about outside the EU?
No, I'm talking about outside the EU,
right, yeah.
Especially in Africa, Latin America, Asia. They're trying to grow their products and sell them, but they can't compete because in the US, in the West, generally actually, so the EU and the US are the biggest abusers of this. We completely regulate and subsidise our farmers. The Belgium and French farmers in the EU are renowned for going on strike if their profit margin goes down by anything other than, like 0.0% or something ludicrous. They're protected industries, and they can say, well, it's for national security reasons. We have to have a constant supply of our own food or some nonsense. But is that true this day and age? The studies which have shown the harm it does to farmers is incalculable, by the way, around the world. Third world farmers who can't compete. And then what happens is, remember what happened? The big scandal in the 90s was that the EU was spending hundreds of millions to store food which had overproduced because the farmers had been subsidised so they could produce as much as possible, right? Because they'd get a little bit more money if they did. And they were storing vast quantities of food, stockpiling it for no reason because of these subsidies. And then they said, oh, okay, we're going to donate a lot of this food to third world countries, particularly in Africa. And they go, okay, we'll give you this food. And so what happened in Africa is a lot of farmers went out of business because they couldn't compete with free food being handed out or subsidised food, and it actually crippled in the short and medium term their own agricultural businesses, and then it actually made things worse. But the sheer fact on a day-to-day basis that in the US and the EU, and I think most Western nations around the world, the food is completely subsidised and by taxpayer money. And this is how the farms keep going, because you could think to yourself, well, there'd be plenty of farmers around the world who could sell us the food, probably the same quality standard at a cheaper price, but they're just not allowed to because of these subsidies that we pay, and it's quite shocking, really. And like I said, some of the reports are really daunting. So they talk about the inequality this policy in itself has created. Where you think you're protecting a more working class element within your own nation, such as farmers, even though a lot of the farmland these days is owned by large corporations and foreign corporations in particular, actually, because of the subsidies they know they can get from it now, because of the profit value of it all. You'd think you're protecting an element in your own country, such as farmers, which have historically lost their jobs because of increased technology and mechanisation, but you end up harming huge swathes of third world country farmers who are trying to make a living and can't sell their products to us because, well, why would we buy them when we've got cheaper products which have been subsidised now by taxpayer money? So,
but to be so just to, do you think that's if I'm honest, I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. Isn't that not competition economically, and shouldn't we have more local food generally? Or, what's your view on that? Because
no. What I'm saying is it's the fact that it's subsidised by the state is harming competition.
Right.
So what I'm saying is the US and the EU in particular, we're not playing ball because, say, we go to the World Trade Organization and we want to, and everyone talks about where we're promoting free trade. Well, agricultural policy is completely off limits.
Right. I see. You're saying just
they're all subsidised globally. No, globally. That's what I'm saying. The fact is that these farmers can't, in the poorest areas of the world, who would be lifted up by a more free trade approach, ironically, that the West always claims it's promoting free trade. Well, not when it comes to agricultural policies, and the impact this has had on the third world is really quite people have talked about, well, I don't know how the reports estimate it, but they talk about hundreds and hundreds of billions, millions and millions of jobs not created, millions of people still in poverty because the West subsidises its own food creation. They support the farmers. They don't allow competition from these other countries, and it means that these countries have to rely on domestic buyers, which they don't always have, and they have it creates a whole range of issues because of that. And some people have talked about, if you'd stopped these subsidies, this is one thing which would really help poorer people around the world, is that the West would stop subsidising and taxpayer money going to our own farmers, and we actually allowed them to compete like we do almost all the other industries, allowed them to compete on the free market against farmers in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and we dropped these barriers and said, we're not going to subsidise you anymore, farmers. Do your best to compete. If you can't compete, obviously people in this country are going to go to the highest quality and cheapest products in the world, because it's natural for anyone to do that. It's a rational choice to go to, in a market economy, to do that, and that would actually help way more poorer farmers around the world. So it's really problematic. And sorry, I don't know how we started me going on this big rant.
No, it's fine. To be honest, I brought myself earlier as well. But it's very interesting. I got one last point about inequality myself. Is in my research on this topic, I found one article by the NY Times about how actually inequality seems to be quite race specific. It's quite interesting, and I've seen a lot of this through migration anyway. But I don't want to get into racism debate because I don't know much about it in this economic sense, but it's clearly targeting certain people. And one statistic they came up with is that between 1992 to 2013, they calculated a kind of median net worth of black people who had also finished college, and they found it actually dropped by 56% in this time, while the median net worth of white people rose 85% of the time, and the Asians 90%. Their reasoning behind this is because of the kind of collapse of the housing bubble in which black and Hispanic families had accumulated a huge amount of debt. But I do think that this is quite quite interesting. This is something that we should probably research more in the future. Is inequality even quite racially segregated? And we do know that, let's be honest, that it's the elites, or whatever are seen as the white elite, and so on. But it'd be better to find some more statistics about how this affects each race differently.
I completely agree with you, Paul, with regards to inequalities in certain races and ethnic minorities in particular. It's interesting you said about America, about the income inequality in between whites and blacks and Hispanics and Asians, and why this is, and some of the racism inherent in the institutions and in parts of the system itself. And another minority I would add to that, more than any others, is the Native Americans. Well, they still call themselves, I believe, Indians, actually, even though it's not a sort of a politically correct term. I mean, it's hard to think about the peoples other than, say, like Jews and Armenians who have been genocided, in World War I and World War II, respectively, who have been, and other Aboriginals due to colonisation in the 19th century. I mean, it's hard to think of the peoples which have been more systematically exploited and abused and destroyed by the system. I mean, they live on reservations. By the way, the reservations are considered nations. It's a nation within a nation. And people don't realise this, that they're treaties dating back to, some of them dating back to the not 1800s, or the late 1800s, early 1900s. But it's a people which have been completely impoverished and destroyed in many ways and forgotten about. When you think of America, you can think of a lot of things about America, but rarely do you even think of Native Americans, or anyway the popular culture at very least. I try to do my best to remember that there's a very small minority of them left, still trying to keep their traditions and languages and culture alive, and they're just contained on reservations, most of them, and forgotten about. I mean, I don't know, Paul. I just thought about that.
That's a good point. If you think about, if you think about Israel and Palestine, American Native Americans are quite an interesting kind of comparison, aren't they? Really, occupation of a land and then siphoning them off to certain little spots which they can call their own nation. This sounds quite familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're right.
It's tough. I mean, it's pretty horrible. The whole situation. It was probably one of the first uses of chemical warfare. Funnily enough, wasn't it? When they used to smuggle measles, wasn't it? In the
British, I think the British Army they wrote about informally or maybe formally about military tactics of smearing smallpox on the blankets and giving the smallpox infected blankets to the tribes, to the Native American tribes which they're in contact with, and then they knowing that this would spread to them and wipe them out. And it, like you said, it's an early form of rudimentary biological warfare, and these diseases spread because they realised that common colds and stuff that the Native Americans didn't have immunities to was really damaging them, and the more severe diseases was just cutting through them like nothing, because obviously Europeans had gone through the plague and the Black Death, and in medieval times waves and waves of diseases which had left only the hardiest and most resilient individuals alive with strong immune systems and a strong immunity to these diseases. So they realised quite primitively that if they've rubbed the smallpox on the blankets and handed them to the Native American tribes, that they would get the disease themselves, then it would spread and wipe them out, which is really horrible. It's a form of ethnic cleansing because they wanted to get rid of them and move them off the land and take over that land. And this is the Brits doing it, which and it's really really horrible. But bringing it back just to economic inequality, I mean, it cuts through so many things. There's race and there's gender and there's classes. And it's difficult to know where to begin. But what I did want to say just before we end this podcast, the one point I did want to bring up is the idea that income and wealth isn't something that we should be judging societies on in the first place, because there's much more. There's much more to be gained from judging societies based on values and culture and ethics and other more beneficial things. And for example, on paper, in say America again, and I briefly talked to Paul and used him as an example when we were talking about education before the podcast, and we'll speak about that, I'm sure, in the coming weeks or months. For example, on paper, the Amish community in America would be some of the poorest. And yet these are individuals, most of which I believe are American citizens, who choose to live or been born into and followed their parents' footsteps in this community, a religious community, in which they live with a very limited technology. They plough the land and they erect barns and they have some livestock to support them. But as far as I'm aware, they don't use electricity. They have candles and they churn their own cheese and they live off the land in the form of subsistence farming. And on paper, they would be considered some of the most impoverished individuals in the country, because all they have as their asset wealth, well, maybe it's a barn and a little bit of land, but it's all shared, and they have some vegetables. However, they may be, now I haven't seen any of the sociological studies, but they may be some of the happiest people. They may be some of the happiest people in the US, just living off the land in their little religious community in the middle of nowhere. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that, Paul. And I mean, do you think income in that regard is this a good way to judge our societies when we're talking about income inequality and the problems? I mean, is it a real problem? Because you talk to someone who's Amish and they want to be Amish, or even a monk or somebody they've chosen to live a life where they don't care about consumerism and having even basic amenities such as electricity and refrigerators. They're like, nah, I'm just going to live off the land in a barn.
No, it's a very interesting topic. I think we could actually rotate a whole podcast around it. The idea that materialism has corrupted our view of what happiness is and what wealth is. And you just look at Christmas coming up now, and Christmas is actually, for me, about family and being a family. But for many, it revolves around presents, especially the younger ones. And there's a whole world to explore there, especially people who are actually, funny enough, have lived in Britain or America. There's various stories of people who've lived there, and they've tried to avoid the materialist life, and by avoiding taxes and making renewable houses. They have energy that's renewable due to hydropower electricity or so on. They have some sort of renewable aspect to their house, and thus they avoid taxes, and they found the governments come and clamp down on them for being so self-sufficient. So another question is, another interesting point that we can discuss in the future is the fact that actually within the systems we live in, it's actually very, very hard to be immaterial because it's forced upon us so much. And I think people need us to not be so self-sufficient, because otherwise we cannot share our skills and talents and help benefit others, which is going to be both a selfless thing, but it can also be a kind of manipulative way of almost enslaving us to kind of continue the materialist tradition by actually feeding it through our work and through our purchases. So it's very interesting, and it's hard to judge. I mean, we're both material as it is now because we're caring about this Skype conversation and this podcast, and it's so easy for us to judge or say this and that. And it's hard to really know if we would really be happy in say, in a world where we live like the Amish without the kind of civilization we know now. I'm sure we would, and I believe we would, but a bit of me does think, am I just kind of idealizing something that I'm not sure necessarily is true. I do believe that at the very least as an ideal that we don't need materialism, but yet here I am on a Mac computer Skyping you, Ciaran, which is lovely, by the way. But it's an interesting topic, and you're right. There should be some further research about happiness relative to wealth. But the problem is that because someone like the Amish don't need wealth to live their life, others who don't have wealth but need it to live the life that they're part of struggle. So it's hard to judge. It's easy to say that the Amish do well because they've left a system that doesn't. I don't know how Amish work, but they're kind of also kind of create their own system and way of living in commune. But for us and for the people who are the poorest in our system, in let's say Britain and in our who depend on welfare benefits or whatever, we can't turn around and say to them that they are happy people, because maybe they need that wealth to continue living within the system. So it's hard to it's hard to judge. I find. Was I clear in that sense? I don't know if I made there's two different types of lack of wealth, which is kind of extending your point, really. I don't know if
I think that makes perfect sense. You're right. There's so many people where, well, this is the system. You don't know. You're unable to go to any other options in most countries, right? You have to live within it, and if you don't live within it, you're punished or clamped down upon. You're persecuted actively. Nobody, you don't have the luxury in America where you can go to the middle of nowhere in a state which may be very liberal and the land's very cheap and fertile, and you can just live off the land, right, in a small commune. Unfortunately, the world isn't like that, and there's scarcity, and there's different inequalities in just the very lands that people live on top of or under or whatever, which you're right, it causes problems because people, the vast majority of people, the system's all they've got, and you have to look at it and think you have to change it somehow or benefit within it, because if you try to live without it, you're going to be either exploited or harmed even more than you would be trying to actually work within the system. Now, I think it's right to point that out, and you only have to think about huge swathes of people, perhaps in India and Pakistan and China, and some of the difficulties that they face, and it's not so easy as just say, well, you can just go and do some community farming and you'll be fine. But it's still important. I think that maybe the nice way to end this podcast is that although there are injustices in the world and we should try and change them for the better, even if the injustices create more inequality in terms of wealth, you don't have to be wealthy to be truly happy, and you're not necessarily going to be unhappy if you are poor, and vice versa. Even if you become rich, it doesn't mean you're automatically going to be happy. So despite the fact we can say there are a lot of inequalities and injustices and we should rage against them, and there are people who are actively unhappy because of those systemic problems, the good news, I think, in the world is that even if one is impoverished or one is struggling in some way, that doesn't mean you're automatically going to be unhappy. And there's even some more, strangely, there's recent research coming out of some of the critical community in the politics and IR fields, where they're looking into happiness during conflict and how people and families and communities stay happy in civil war and periods of mass conflict, because apparently there are people that can stay happy and keep their spirits up and live, even though it's a very intense and traumatic life, they can still live within that and find some form of happiness. So that's the real brilliance, I think, in humans, is that even in some of the worst and some of the most disastrous situations, there's always a way to see light and find happiness and not be so depressed that you go, right, that's it, I'm out of here, and you check out. Which is, I guess, it's one of the strengths of humanity more than anything else. And maybe it gives hope to people that, if you are struggling with this materialist world and you think that, you're going to be happier if you just make a little bit more money or get that promotion, say if you're living in the West, for example, that, well, maybe you should, especially in the West, rethink some of your attitudes and some of your lifestyles choices and go, well, I would be, if the Amish people can be happy, or people in really impoverished situations, and like peasants in the countryside of China or India, for example, can find happiness, why can't I, when I've got a world, I live in a country where I've just inundated with food and power and electricity and entertainment 24/7 if I want it, and it's all relatively inexpensive. So it's really strange what what modern society has done in the West. But in my opinion, gratitude, in my opinion, is always the best attitude. I know it's a cliched saying, but looking at how happy and some people can be in such devastating situations always makes me reflect on my own circumstances and think, yeah, why the hell am I worried about X, Y, and Z? Because these are really minor, and I've got so much and to be happy for. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that point.
No, I agree. I'm being quite grateful for what we have. I definitely think I can't really ever speak of being. Every time I kind of feel like I'm hard done by, I kind of remember actually, in the global context, I'm pretty lucky. So yeah, I didn't on the same kind of note for my personal self. And I just want to say, I think from now on, Ciaran, maybe we should have a word count for the amount of times we say system in a podcast.
Okay, that's probably for me. That's me talking about the system all the time.
Yeah. Right, shall we wrap it up then? Shall we say,
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, guys. I hope it's been good, and you'll hear from us probably again in a fortnight's time. I've had a good time, some interesting debates and further questions, and I think you have as well, Ciaran, right?
Yeah, I have. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. And we will be back. Well, I will be doing a podcast on Saturday with a gentleman called Aaron Good, who's a PhD student in the US, who's published a very interesting article in a peer-reviewed political science journal. And I'm going to be discussing that with Aaron. And that should be edited and uploaded shortly afterwards. And then Paul and I think we're going to go back into the routine again. So you can look forward to that too in the coming weeks.
Great. See you guys.
Thanks.